Welcome everybody to another developer cast here on the Game Wisdom channel. I am of course Josh Placer, and we have another great cast for you this week. We have another developer on to talk about the design of their game. My guest tonight is artist as well as lead designer on Manifold Garden, a game that was developed over 7 years. It was finally released a few weeks ago, and we're going to be discussing the game with him. So please welcome to the podcast, William Chyr.
Oh, thanks, Josh. Thanks for having me here.
Not a problem. How are you doing tonight?
I'm good.
It is a pleasure to have you on, and I just want to say definitely congratulations on the release of the game.
Yes, thank you.
I know I was looking up some of the stuff that you talked about, especially with how long it took to develop. I know it definitely was a very challenging process for you.
Yeah. I think challenging. I guess that's one way to describe it. I mean, it's just a long cycle. 7 years.
Yeah.
So it's been a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've had guests on who spend so many different amount of times on their games, especially with something so visually distinctive as Manifold Garden as well, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss about that tonight. But for the chat watching us right now live, if you have any questions for Will about the game, art, or anything else, definitely let us know in the comments. But my first question for you, since this is your first time on my cast, could you talk a little bit about your background in the game industry? And for people watching us, what is Manifold Garden?
Yeah, my background in the industry really only consists of Manifold Garden. I had no experience here prior to working on the game. So I guess if you include from the day I started it, which would be November 2012, I guess I've been in the industry for 7 years. But that transition, I guess, from whatever I was doing to, if one can call what I'm doing now professional, that sort of happened. I don't know if there was a day where it happened. It kind of was a transition over a long period. In terms of what the game is, what is the game? It is a exploration of impossible geometry and architecture. There was actually a review from Rock Paper Shotgun that came out today, and it said a lot of people have been calling Manifold Garden a 3D puzzle game, but those people are wrong. It is actually a horror game, non-Euclidean existential horror.
And as I was just telling Will before we started, I finished the game last week, and my review and video review will be going up this week for everybody watching this right now. But I definitely had a lot of fun with it, and it is definitely a trip. I think I was telling people I got almost like a contact high when I saw that ending. I was playing that like late at night. I was like, okay, the room is like still like spinning right now. I better stop watching this. But definitely a lot to talk about with the design of the game. And I know you also, I think, designed or you did Twitch streams while you were making the game as well, right?
I still do. I was actually streaming right before this this cast. Yeah, I think I started streaming about in 2015,
Mm-hmm.
and at the time it was just a lot of people were talking about streamers and YouTubers sort of being the way you market games now. Like it wasn't about press. It wasn't about the traditional media outlets. And at the time, I didn't watch Twitch, or I didn't really watch YouTube, but I wanted to learn more about it. So I thought, hey, let's try streaming. That's turned out to be sort of one of the best aspects of development for me. Especially as an indie, I work from home.
Yeah.
So we do talk to the team on Slack, but I think, and now we've got a sizable team, but for a long time it was just me alone. But I think having the stream and having the community there was really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one that I've heard from some other indie devs as well about streaming their development process while they're making the game, and that seems to be like as you said, like another way not only to get PR or marketing your game, but also kind of like building your own network of people as well, of those who literally watch you build this game and then they go out and buy it when it comes out.
Yeah, I don't think of it so much as a network, but just a community.
Mm-hmm.
We've had, uh, I think one of the hardest parts about working alone, which I was doing for the first
Yeah.
3 years, is, when you have bad days, there's no
Yeah.
one to kind of complain to about it. And when you have good days, there's no one really there to celebrate your victories with you. But having, yeah, I think at this point we've been streaming for 4 years, and some people have been following for as long. And when we shipped, we had a celebration stream, and I think a lot of the people there they knew what it was like to finally release the game for so long, because they had been watching the development of it for
Yeah.
almost as long.
Yeah. And again, like when we talk about games that get into like the multi-year time frame like that, it can be very rough for any developer in terms of making a game. As you said, when you're solo, it's just you. Like if you decide one day I don't feel like working on it, there's nobody else who's going to pick up the slack and do it for you. It gets done only if you're the one who can make it happen.
Yeah.
So there's only a lot to discuss. Again, with 7 years of development, that means a whole lot must have gone about in terms of design, developing the title. So I guess the first question on my mind then is, where did Manifold Garden come from to begin with?
So I've got to go back a bit to before what I was doing before Manifold Garden. I was actually an installation artist working, and I was doing kind of these large scale balloon structures. I mean, my plan really had been more, and my eyes set more on like the contemporary art space. These balloon installations, which you can see on my website, uh, they were, I guess, eye catching is the word, but one of the problems that I had there was, so they got attention, but the medium sort of overshadowed the work itself.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of did it for about 4 years, and the reaction that I got for the work that I did in the last year were oftentimes exactly the same reaction, which was, "Oh, cool, balloons." And that it was like, it didn't matter what you did with it, the novelty of it using balloons will always overshadow what you did. And the thing is, like, nobody is a connoisseur of balloons, right? They're not familiar with all these techniques. So I think that was really frustrating. And then it was also, I felt like I was on the precipice of just becoming the balloon person for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
So I was actually trying to look for another medium to go into, and I had considered like glass blowing, metalworking, and a friend of mine at the time I had also worked briefly at a advertising agency, and a friend there was really into indie games. This was in 2012. I think he had backed Indie Game the movie, so
Okay.
that had just come out and invited me over to watch it. That was very inspirational. We also played, Journey, I think Flower, a couple of the other games that came out around that time. And I'd done a little bit of programming at that point, and I'd also done some like 3D modeling here and there. So I thought, hey, well, video games just, a bit of design, a bit of 3D modeling, a bit of programming. How hard can it be? And my original idea was to make this, like many people's first idea was to make an MMO. There's going to be cyberpunk set in Chicago, and there was going to be time travel. So it's like Skyrim meets cyberpunk, MMO, time travel. And I was like, okay, maybe this sounds a little big, so maybe I should make a small practice game in Unity to become familiar with the engine. And that small practice game, which is supposed to take 3 months, ended up taking 7 years, and is what Manifold Garden is. So it started off as a small practice game to become familiar with Unity before I worked on my time travel cyberpunk MMO.
I'm sure you still won't go back to that one too, right?
No, I've dropped that idea. It's actually a terrible idea, you know. now that I've had 7 years to think about it.
And I was looking up some of the information about Manifold Garden. The original name for it was Relativity, right?
Yeah, so I asked my friend, at this time, I hadn't played games actually for about, I would say like 8, 9 years at that point. I mean, I played a ton when I was a kid. I got an N64 for I think my 11th Christmas. Um, played a ton of Tony Hawk Pro Skater, and then I think like starting in high school, I just stopped. So I didn't play games throughout high school or college, and I started asking around like, hey, where do people buy games these days? And of course, Steam was the answer. And I downloaded Steam, and I happened to have there was a single game in my library, which is Portal. And the reason is that I think about a year before that, when Portal 2 came out, a year or two when Portal 2 came out, Valve was doing a promotion where if you signed up for Steam, you got a free copy of Portal.
Mm-hmm.
And I signed up then uh, because I think someone at the office was telling me to, but I never downloaded it. And then finally, a year later, when I downloaded Steam, Portal was there. So I played it. And that kind of, the early versions of Manifold Garden were very much just a straight up Portal clone. Relativity. So we picked like a single word kind of with a sci-fi angle. I thought, okay, Portal's got the one mechanic. Portal, let's just have gravity changing, because also Inception had come out.
Mm-hmm.
I'd seen it not too long ago, and there was the scene where they fold Paris in half, and Leonardo DiCaprio's walking up the wall, and I thought, oh, that's an interesting mechanic. So let's see, let's have a mechanic. It'll take me a week. Portal has like what 10 levels, so each level will take me a week. But towards the end, I'll get really fast at making levels, so they might only take a day or two, and then I'll do the save system, UI, and sound design all in the last week. I was thinking, all games have those things. How hard can it be? And I think in the end, the save system alone probably took us like a year and a half. We're still struggling with the save system. It's such a pain.
And I'm sure, like as you just described that, well, like for every like indie dev watching this, either live or recorded, they're probably getting like chest pains right now. It'll only take a week to make this, or an extra week just to do a UI. It's all that simple, right? Because I think every developer, like on their first game, thinks just that.
It's a very humbling experience, and you see a lot of the discussions online, and people are saying, well, hey, why don't the devs do this? Why don't they just add multiplayer? And I mean, I it's frustrating as a dev to read that, but I can also see why people have these, why it's so easy to underestimate what goes in, because I did the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's one of the more fascinating things about like all the developers I've spoken to in the last 7 years is that, again, like game design is one of those things that you never really understand just how much work goes into it unless you either know somebody who does it or you do it yourself. And it's one of like the great joys of being able to do these podcasts with so many people.
Yeah, it's I think, I'm not sure what it is. Maybe like a fundamental human flaw where, because you think it's like, well, I've played a bunch of games, therefore making one must be easy. Um,
I'm sure my entire audience, after you just said, they're now going to start sending me messages. Josh, why don't you go make a platformer? You can do it in 2 weeks. You wrote a book on it. It shouldn't be that hard for you, right? But yeah, it's definitely crazy. And again, with something like Manifold Garden, from a design standpoint, like puzzle design is a very fascinating topic. I think it's another one of those areas that a lot of people don't really think about in terms of building a game, because it is something that, on one hand, is interactable, but it's still this handmade challenge by a developer. So, I guess with that question, like as you said earlier, like you had the original concept of kind of altering gravity, changing like the plane that you're on. Were there any other like mechanics or elements that you thought of that you eventually had to scrap for Manifold Garden?
yeah, actually the very first implementation was not. changing gravity. It was actually the whole world
Okay.
changing. So you rotated the entire
Okay.
world, and that had some problems right away, which is, if you put any objects in there, as soon as you rotate, like you imagine a scene, you set it up, you put
Yeah.
on all the furniture, the tables. As soon as there's a single rotation, they all fall to the bottom corner.
Yeah.
And now you just got this room with all these objects flying around. And that was the very first implementation. And I remember showing it to a bunch of Chicago developers, and my friend Andy played it, and he was asking me, he asked me like, "Hey, what are you trying to say with your mechanic?"
Hmm.
And and that was very enlightening, because what I had wanted, the kind of the core theme of the game is being able to look at things from different perspectives.
Hmm.
And if you do that, so in that case, the problem stays the same, but your viewpoint of it changes. And so if you look at this very first version of the game where the world rotates, but the player stays the same, that's not quite the correct metaphor, right?
Hmm.
Because in that way, in that case, you're changing the problem, whereas you stay the same.
Hmm.
But what we ended up implementing is the player changing gravity. So it's like the problem staying the same, but your perspective of it changes. Um, but I had that first version, I think, for about 4 months, and there are ideas in there that ended up finding their way into the final game. But um, yeah, I had that version for 4 months, and then threw it all out and um, kind of started from scratch in, I want to say, like January of 2013, or March of 2013, I think.
Okay.
Um,
And as a quick word to the people watching, I do have a few questions for Will that will be, I guess, semi spoiler related. I'm not going to discuss solutions, but I do have a few questions for you about, like, kind of like the puzzle mechanics themselves. So,
sure.
as a bit of a warning for those of you watching this, if you want to go in, completely sight unseen, just a spoiler warning right now. So, I think from as you said in terms of the original system of rotating the world versus rotating the player, going through the game, like there's different elements, like there's like different variations of that theme, such as changing the water, changing like
Yep.
water perspectives, um, manipulating like the kind of the tetranemos or the giant blocks. I guess how did you, I guess, eventually come up with like what kind of, I guess, puzzles or what kind of elements you wanted to include in Manifold Garden?
Yeah, during the first 2 years I think a lot of those ideas came about during the first 2 years, because it's easy to come up with big ideas like that. I think
Hmm.
what made it a challenge was tying everything together. So coming up with these big mechanics, that's pretty easy, but it's like connecting them together and making it cohesive, and then creating puzzles based on that.
Yeah.
I think for us, we went through, or at least I did, kind of went through a lot of changes in my philosophy to puzzle design.
Hmm.
And initially the game was very much just a puzzle game.
Hmm.
So it was one puzzle after another, one room after another, and very quickly we noticed, every time we play tested the game, or I play tested the game, it was just me at the time. After the sixth level, everybody would start yawning. They'd have been playing for about 20, 25 minutes, and they'd say, like, how long is this thing? Um, so I realized, okay, you can have puzzles, but you got to break them up. There's got to be stuff in between, otherwise people get puzzle fatigue.
Hmm.
And Portal solves that by having the humor, having the story, and sort of right about when it starts to feel like it's going to overstay its welcome, that's when they kind of have that ending sequence. You break out of
Hmm.
the laboratory setup, but the way they've done it there is very clever. The lab setup is like just a perfect setting for having these kind of puzzle test rooms. But and a lot of people actually suggested that early on. They said, "Hey, why don't you have a voiceover? Why don't you have a story?" But I knew as soon as I started doing that, people were going to compare it to Portal,
Yeah.
and we weren't. I'm not as good as a writer. I'm not as good of a writer as the people at Valve.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's kind of where like the architecture started to come in, and over time, I think it took a really long time to recognize that the core of the game was actually not the puzzles, but the exploration of architectural space. That is really the joy. And we actually ended up scaling down on a lot of the puzzles. So if you play a game like The Witness, I think there you can see that what Jonathan Blow is really interested in is this almost exhaustive exploration of a mechanical space. Like there were just so many puzzles in that
Mm-hmm.
game, but there's a certain beauty in how complete that exploration is, but the that's not what serves Manifold Garden. The puzzles in there are only enough puzzles to get you to notice something interesting about the rules. So
Mm-hmm.
we have um, and it's interesting now seeing a lot of the reviews, a lot of the mainstream press, which I would probably not describe as hardcore puzzle enthusiasts. A lot of what they like is that they found the game actually quite accessible. You would think with the gravity changing, with the world wrapping,
Mm-hmm.
that it could be very disorienting, but I think for a lot of them, they're like a lot of the praises for the game are about how they're able to find their way through the game, um, and navigate and not find it too difficult. Of course, and we do have secrets. So there are secrets if you want to go really hardcore. But some of the more puzzle enthusiasts, some of their criticism is that they felt that the game was too easy, that they blasted through it in 3 hours. But for us, the game isn't about challenging you with
Mm-hmm.
very difficult puzzles. Like we realized we used to have these rooms that I called exam rooms. So you'd walk in, so you'd learn concept A, you learn concept B, you learn concept C, and here was an exam room that combined A, B, and C. But you didn't really learn anything new. It just sort of reviewed concepts. And I think that the fact that we called it an exam room is indication that that's not a lot of fun, right? Who takes exams for fun? And we ended up removing all of those because those we realized were not, there was no aha moment. Everything you learned there you already knew. We were just reviewing your knowledge for the sake of
Just to stop the
reviewing it,
player.
just to
Yeah.
have you, yeah. And so we're like, let's get rid of that. We should only have puzzles if they have an aha moment, if they make you see, understand, if you get a new understanding about the world. And
Mm-hmm.
that's all we do with the puzzles.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to like kind of the puzzle theory in a second. But I think one thing that you said that I found very interesting was this idea of kind of wrapping puzzles around either a story or some kind of like environment. Because I think that's one of the big things that's kind of happened to a lot of the puzzle-ish kind of games this past decade is that we've seen that kind of wrapper around them. You mentioned, of course, the Witness. I think about games like the Talos Principle, the Swapper, even going further back with Bray and of course Portal. That, as you said, if it's just puzzle after puzzle after puzzle with like nothing in between, it just kind of like I think it just wears the person down. That they just have here's 100 different puzzles, just keep playing them, and when you get to the end, you can stop playing the game. And I've played many indie games that do just that, and I do run into that. Like about like 10, 20 puzzles in, I'm like, oh great, I got 50 more of these to do, and it's just going to be maybe instead of go left, right, left, it's right, left, right this time. And we've really seen, I think, a lot of developers, especially with yourself and Manifold Garden, kind of elevate or raise that bar in terms of what you can get out of a puzzle game.
We struggled with that for a long time, though. I think one of the criticisms we had halfway through development, and it really stuck with us, was the game currently has too much manifold and not enough garden. And I think it was just that it kind of focused a lot on the technical aspects, and there were we had what I call short-term goals, like, hey, here's a puzzle you got to get out of this room, but what was sort of the mid and long term, like, why are you we would watch these play tests. So over time, we were able to address the puzzle fatigue issue with the architecture, and so people weren't yawning and getting bored after 20, 30 minutes. But after we were noticing after 60, 70 minutes, people were like, okay, why am I still playing this? I mean, I'm enjoying the puzzles, but why am I doing this instead of watching Star Wars. Um,
Yeah. And I'm assuming that's when kind of like the idea, like the whole corruption and the kind of, I think they're called God cubes, like that kind of like overall overarching narrative started to take shape.
yeah, and that all happened, I think, in the last year of development.
Okay. And I won't get to this question that came up a few minutes ago. Jim Clover asked, "Did you have a knowledge of architecture before you started developing the game?"
A little bit. I'd actually considered going to architecture school right after college, and I remember looking at a bunch of schools, and I filled out the application. The only thing that I was stuck, I got all like the whatever recommendations and test scores or whatever grades I was needed, and the only thing that I was stuck on was I couldn't, you had to write an essay explaining why you wanted to be an architect, and I couldn't find a good answer. Well, I had an answer. It was to make cool looking stuff, but I felt that it wasn't sufficient. And ultimately, I think I'm really glad to working on architecture in Manifold Garden is in a way a very pure form. Right, you're not bogged down by uh, the physicality of materials. We don't have to bring in a civil engineer to make sure that this structure isn't going to fall over. We don't have to worry about zoning issues. We don't have to worry about plumbing. We don't have to worry about where to put the bathroom or, accessibility features, all that. It's just, it's the creation of a space solely for the purpose of player experience, which I think is really neat.
Yeah. And speaking about player experience, I think that takes me to this next question. Like with like the actual like puzzle theory of the game, we'll probably spend I'll probably have a lot more discussion about this over the next few minutes. But one of the things I thought was very fascinating about the kind of puzzle structure was kind of like the mid to late game puzzles that almost
Right.
became like these like miniature worlds. So you had to kind of go into this big area and figure out, okay, what is happening here? Where is even the exit or the thing I have to do, and then and what I did in a lot of those puzzles was kind of like walk my way back. Like I found the exit or where I needed to go. Like okay, so if this is the exit point, what is connecting to it, and kind of like almost like reverse engineer the solution.
Yeah. Yeah, there were I think we had a few what I call guiding principles
Mm-hmm.
uh, when I was approaching puzzles. One, a friend told me a long time ago. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Prestige.
Yes.
I think with Chris Nolan, and yeah, because we've drawn a lot of inspiration from Chris Nolan movies. But there's the line that they talk about in the trailer. A magic trick composes is composed of three parts.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of you start with something normal, you show someone like a bird and they can touch it and it's just a regular bird,
Mm-hmm.
and then in the second step you make that bird disappear.
Mm-hmm.
um, However, that's not enough. You have to have the third step, which is the prestige, where you bring the bird back.
Mm-hmm.
And I think puzzle design, they can follow in a very similar way, and we try to do this with all of them. So first we show the player a very simple mechanic. This is the rules. So you've got in Manifold Garden, it's different colored cubes fall in their respective gravity. So a blue cube always falls in the blue gravity. A green cube always falls in the green gravity. When you're in green gravity, you can't touch blue cubes are stuck. When you're in blue gravity, green cubes are stuck. So that's very simple. Players are like, okay, I get it.
Mm-hmm.
You've color coordinated objects in gravity. And now I guess our second step is realizing, you can put these on switches, you can turn them on. And then we've got that puzzle very early on. You walk into a room and all of a sudden this switch, it's a blue switch, but it's on the wall. And or the wall relative to blue. And when you put the blue cube on that switch, it falls down.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're thinking like, when you're faced with that puzzle, your first thought is, this is impossible. But then you start to think about it and you play with it and you're like, oh no, this is just a consequence of this rule set that I have learned before. And there's that aha moment. So that's what we try to do. Like, I think of puzzle design as the creation of a thought sentence. here's the mechanic, here's what you can do, and then wait a minute, this looks impossible, but oh wait, it actually is possible within given what I know. So that's kind of one of the when we were approaching puzzle design, we always wanted that arc for the player to experience. You talk about kind of finding that walking into a space, figuring out where you need to go. Another principle, I actually have it on a piece of paper on the wall behind my computer, is lock first, key second. So when you walk into a room, we used to do this a lot where you put the key there. But then you pick it up and you're like, what is this for?
Yeah.
And then you go around looking for a lock. But what's more interesting is you come across the lock first. And now you're thinking, okay, I got to go look for a key. And when you do find the key, oh, that area before, now I know what to do with it. So it's like the creation of a mystery, and now you got to go find the solution for this. So I think having here's an area that's locked. Okay, now I got to figure out, I know this is an exit. There must be an entrance somewhere, and then you can piece it together. I always tell, one of the things that we see people do when they're playing the game is that they'll panic, and then when they panic, they just start changing gravity. And that's the worst thing you can do. What you just need to do is slow down and take a look around.
Yeah.
And then look at what the world is trying to tell you.
And some of the more complicated areas in the game are these just massive environments where it almost is kind of like one giant puzzle that's then broken down to maybe 4 or 5 smaller puzzles. You complete those little tasks and then lead you back to the main room, and you're just kind of again you're just following that trail of breadcrumbs. And
right.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and there that's really important to sort of establish different. Part of it is having different threads happening. So, you're working on the puzzle in this room, but ultimately what you're really trying to do is unlock this other level, and you're doing that to bring back the garden. So games, a lot of the tycoon management games do this very well. You really want to buy this piece of farm, but you need to make this much money first, so you have to
do some
do all these other things, but so you've got kind of 5, 6 different things all happening at once, and that took us a really long time to find, because it used to be just puzzle. Yeah. So it took us a really long time to find this meta structure and having multiple threads going.
Yeah. And the first time I ran into that, I was confusing myself, going, wait, did I miss a solution in this room? Was there some secret way out? And then when I left, and all of a sudden I walk every which way around, I'm like, oh wait, I'm back here, but now I have the solution to this thing that I thought I had to solve 20 minutes ago. Let me see. Question from Brian Broderick. And I think this actually is a good lead into talking about the art. And again, we'll talk more about design over the length of this cast. He wanted to ask, he was interested in your thoughts on efficiency. The game seems to achieve a lot without excessive art input. Any thoughts on efficiency game making, i.e., impact effort, kind of?
Right. I would not necessarily say Manifold Garden is efficient, but it is minimalistic. Mm-hmm. And perhaps it might appear simplistic, but it is only deceptively so. Mm-hmm. We do not have a lot of the typical trappings, so there's no textures, there's no characters, and I think that does make the iteration a lot faster. So we basically go from gray box to final art instantly because it's all in shaders. And part of that came from my own workflow. So I think the best thing you can do as an indie is to work to your strength. And remember how I talked about that very first version of the game that I spent 4 months working on, where the world rotated? I remember I used to spend I would spend an entire afternoon looking for the perfect concrete texture. And the game still looked terrible because I was trying to emulate the AAA art style without AAA budget, AAA team, AAA talent. However, one thing that I did have some experience with was shader programming and graphics programming. And so that's like, we went with an art style that played to our strength. And actually, we never really had um, like an art lead. We've had a bunch of people help us with uh, a bit of 3D modeling and animation here and there, but there's never been a primary artist on the team other than me. And I never really considered myself that way. It was just this. We had Arthur, the graphics programmer, who made a huge difference when he joined the team in 2017. But it was always this back and forth conversation. Him making changes and improving our post processing stack, and then me saying like, okay, that looks good. Let's kind of double down on that and iterate on that some more. But it is we kind of lucked into it, but I would not. There are a lot of things about it that are not as efficient as they might appear. We've and of course it was like, because it was optimal in some ways, we then really pushed it in others. So yes, we don't have textures, but now because of the roll wrapping, we have to render, or well, essentially we copy the mesh on a 5x5x5 grid. So it's we do trim the corners, but basically the stuff that the space that we saved with the lack of textures, we then filled it up by having the world duplicated 125 times.
And that, like, the first time I saw that, that was just like one of like the trippiest moments for me. Especially like at one point, I just like started just like falling infinitely, just to like stare at this world just infinitely looping around you, and it does just look fantastic. I guess like that idea of the infinite loop, was that something that was kind of there at the beginning when you were starting to come with Manifold Garden, or did that kind of develop over the course of making it?
It was not. It came about in 2014, and the way that happened was the original version of the game. It was indoors, and you changed gravity, and you just kind of went from room to room to room. But a lot of people asked for a light source so that they could see shadows on the cubes, and that could help them line up where it was going to fall.
Mm-hmm.
And so we added a light source. It was just like a single directional light. It looked really weird because there's no light objects in the room, but you'd see shadows. And so players were like, where's this light coming from? So what I did was I added a window. And now all of a sudden you can see outside. And players were saying, hey, can I go outside? I really want to go outside. That looks really cool. And I was hesitant because I was like, well, if they fall outside, then it's really hard to guide the player where they need to go. At least just, we found solutions over time, but early on, to go where I had just designed, like every room had a single entrance and a single exit, and there was just the next room, the next room, the next room, letting the player go outside and have this wide open space that was very intimidating. But I did it, and players could go outside. But then, of course, if you're outside, there's a problem of what happened when you fall off. And one of the things that I wanted to have in the game was I wanted everything that you're able to see, you can get to. Because the first time I played Skyrim, that was my first Bethesda game. To be able to see a mountain in the distance and then end up on that mountain was mind blowing. Versus a game like BioShock Infinite, which I think in one of the early levels they kind of had these floating islands, not islands, like these ships, and it's like very clearly I can jump and land on that area beneath me and not injure myself too horribly. But there were just all these invisible colliders stopping me from exploring. So I didn't want that kind of experience, right, where it felt like a theme park where things were cut off. I really wanted that sense of exploration, the sense of openness, that the world is all accessible. And so now, the problem with gravity changing and being outside is you cannot stop players from getting to certain places, because without gravity changing, okay, I might have a castle in the distance, and I've just got this, I don't know, this bridge, and the bridge is broken, and you can't traverse the bridge because you'd fall to your death. And so you're able to have this visual that has a very logical reason for why you can't access that. But with gravity changing, well, that doesn't matter. The broken
Hmm.
bridge isn't going to prevent the player. They would just change gravity and land onto the top
Yeah.
of the castle. And I was like, well, I can't keep making new content. I mean, that's just insane. How do we deal with this? And then I thought, well, if we had the world repeat itself, then you'd have stuff in the distance that the player can see while simultaneously maintaining the promise I made to myself, which is everything you see, you can get to. Sure, it's the same thing that you have now, but it fills the space visually while not setting these really unpleasant invisible barriers to stop exploration.
Hmm. And also, again, leads to that trippiness when you shift the plane to the wrong perspective, and all of a sudden you just literally fall off the side of the area, and then you see where you're landing is just like some other part of that environment you didn't even realize was there.
Yeah, it actually became it's hard to imagine manifold mechanic, and I think the gravity changing and
Hmm.
roll wrapping actually go really well together because it precisely because the roll wrapping can be so disorienting.
Hmm.
They well, each of them on their own can be disorienting, but they almost sort of help offset each other because the roll wrapping essentially gives you a map of the space. If you just look at a distance, you can see how the world is constructed.
Hmm.
And then the gravity changing lets you get into different positions to help you visualize what's going on, right? If you're like, oh man, like I can't really see anything from here, but if I were to just get up to that ledge, then I have a much better viewpoint. Well, you can do that.
Hmm. Yep. And I guess as a bit of a question then, like as you get further into Manifold Garden, you started running more of the puzzles that kind of make use or almost seem to require that sense of looping to get into the right perspective or get into the right direction. I guess how did having the infinity loop there kind of affect the puzzle philosophy as you went further into the game?
Yeah, we wanted to utilize it more. We knew it'd be a little. It's I think the puzzles that use the looping tend to be less. One of the progressions that we wanted was for puzzles to start off in small contained rooms and then go on to so every puzzle is just like here's a room, here's a room,
Hmm.
here's a room, here's a puzzle, here's a room, here's a puzzle. And then as you get a little bit further into the game, now the puzzles encompass entire levels. So here's a room, here's a puzzle, when you um, but now you have to solve multiple of them to then solve a level in the puzzle. And then we wanted that to get bigger. So now it's using the entire level. You're using the world wrapping, and now the entire level is a puzzle. So they do the world wrapping puzzles are later because of that progression, because the puzzles themselves and the space that they take up and the space, the arena that they're in, do get bigger. But we also realized that they were just much more visceral.
Yeah.
The puzzles at the beginning involve a lot of precise placement of cubes. Not even that precise. They used to be they're sort of like a 2 to 3 block range. What do they call it? Error in
Margin of error.
statistics. Margin of error, exactly. We used to have there used to be the shader in the game used to have this grid on it. So there was this grid in the game, and you had to be very precise. There's like this puzzle only worked if the cube was placed exactly 4 units above the ground. And then but I didn't really like the grid look. It looked very mechanical. And then I realized, wait, I don't need the grid if I don't need the player to precisely place it 4 units above, right? I mean,
Hmm.
it's the same idea, and it can be anywhere from like 3 to 5. And so we just gave them a larger margin of error and then got rid of the grid. But there's still sort of this precision involved, and you do need to know that it's like before you can read Shakespeare, you've got to learn grammar, and it's not fun to learn about adjectives and pronouns and whatever. But that's they're sort of this boring stuff that you do have to get through to get to the fun stuff, and that I kind of see that the precision puzzles as a necessary evil before we get to the really fun stuff. But for us, those puzzles that involve falling are they're almost like action sequences. They're intended to be much more visceral. The ball puzzle is a great example, and that's why we place it relatively
Mm-hmm.
early. So you've done all these puzzles that are very challenging, that are very logic based, and here's just a fun one where you can fall around and get comfortable and fly around and feel like you're making good progress, but really you're guiding a ball through a pipe.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a simple puzzle, but it's really fun.
Mm-hmm. And before we get to some more puzzle-related questions, Brian asked another question. Any lessons learned along the way to increase the efficiency of development?
I don't know if they're less necessarily learned. They're just things that having experience making it now, we know what to do, and a lot of that is behind the scenes. So, for example, it's a lot of people are like, well, if you went back in time, would you make Manifold Garden the same way? Would you use Unity? Would you use Unreal? And my answer is, if I could go back in time, I would buy bitcoins. I take all my money, I borrow more money. Um, but I think a more relevant and interesting question is, okay, what would I do now if I were to make another game?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I would probably look into a lot of the quality of life improvements, like getting build servers set up. We're migrating right now. We use Perforce for version control, and we're using classic Perforce, which doesn't allow for branching. And that was fine when we just had one version of the game and we're focused on getting it out. But all of a sudden, it's like we have bug fixes, new features, new content, new platforms. We have to have multiple versions of the project, and the way we set it up does not allow for that. So now we have to migrate the system with, I don't know, 10, 20 users. So it's like a lot of things that I wish we had done differently would make our life a lot easier now. I probably would not have a save system like ours. Manifold Garden does persistent save across the entire game. Right? You can bring a cube from
Okay.
one level to another, and you can save that exact moment. Like very few games do that, but we just have so many problems from the save system. But if we were making a roguelike, we don't have to worry about that at all. And not saying I want to make a roguelike, but I think just taking into consideration the complexities of something as basic as the save system is something that I would take into consideration more. Or even, Manifold Garden, all the scenes are loaded in the background. So you can go from the start of the game to the end of the game without a single loading screen. And that is also very challenging, unlike Firewatch, which is also an open world-ish game. But what they do is they have the days. So day one ends, they show the screen, it says the next day. During that time, in the background, they're unloading all the levels, resetting everything. So it gives, from a technical standpoint, there is this breathing room, right?
Yeah.
They're like, okay, maybe there's some bugs in the first day, but that's not going to carry over. They get to start with a blank canvas. Manifold Garden, we can't do that. So if something starts to go wrong, it just adds up. And that was something that we struggle with a lot. If you have a memory leak, it will, might not be a problem that first hour, but it will be a problem down the line. We have to take that into consideration. But those were, I think, some of them. I think I would just be a little, not saying I wouldn't do it, because having done it now, we know what to do, but I would be more cautious of design choices and the technical implications that they have.
Okay. And as a quick time check, it's about 6:30 my time, 5:30 your time. You say you have to get going in about 30 minutes. So, for the chat watching, we will be doing probably a last call for questions in maybe the next 10 to 15 minutes thereabouts. So, if you have anything for Will, please get them in. I have a few more design-related questions, and then I want to kind of talk about more going back to the development of the game overall. So one thing that kind of stood out to me that I want to get your thoughts on is that despite, again, so much of a focus on movement and getting around the world, that Manifold Garden does not have any kind of jumping-based system. Because that was literally the first thing I experimented was just hit spacebar and jump, and no, it didn't work like that. So I guess was there like any point in the game that you were thinking about having like a jumping mechanic or platforming, or did that just never, or did you decide not to do like that kind of element in this game?
No, we did have jumping at first because that's
Yeah,
what all first person games do.
yeah,
They you can jump, but I think part of it is I think about a year into development, we just realized it wasn't necessary because of the gravity changing. It made it right. I mean, a lot of times you're jumping to get onto a higher surface, uh, but that's made redundant in a world where you can change gravity.
mm-hmm.
And why would you jump when you can just walk up the wall
Mm-hmm.
so it also just made a lot of it didn't add to the game, and it also made it impossible to have some of the puzzles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like some puzzles wouldn't be in the game if you could jump, and we thought like those having that challenge actually was more interesting, and
Yeah.
the ability to jump itself. It did, yeah. Part of it, the problem is that it also makes people think that jumping is needed for the solution, and we wanted to eliminate. Part of puzzle design is not just helping people discover the correct solution; it's like eliminate the possibility of the bad solutions.
Yeah. Trying to figure out what works and what doesn't, and then eventually narrowing it down to what is the correct solution.
Yeah, we just didn't want people wasting time thinking, oh, if I just jumped, if I
Mm-hmm.
ran and jumped a little bit earlier, then I can arrive at this. We didn't sort of want to um, have that even be in the realm of possibility.
Mm-hmm. And getting back to the art for a second, as you said earlier, like you didn't really consider like an quote unquote like an artist like for having the game, but the game definitely has a very like striking aesthetic to it. Were there like other versions or other aesthetics to Manifold Garden, or like did you sell on this one very quickly or very early
Oh,
on?
no, a million. Yeah, I mean, even this current iteration has has gone through many many changes. I mean, I think the early ones were very much bad Portal clones. That is how I would describe that art style. And then I think for a long time it also looked a lot like Antichamber. I mean, we still get Antichamber comparisons, but I think if you look at the two games side by side, they appear different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think a lot of people say Manifold Garden is how you think you remember Antichamber look like, or something. But a lot of it is in the detail. The the architectural aspects we used to, we draw a lot of inspiration from brutalism. Sure, these large kind of minimalist buildings made out of concrete. And the problem there we ran into is we actually had a really difficult way of conveying scale.
Mm-hmm.
And brutalist buildings look big in real life because it's always about having something to compare to, right? You see an image of a building, you see somebody standing there, and like, okay, well that building's massive, right? There's human elements to compare it to. There's the texture of the concrete, but in Manifold Garden, none of those exist. You don't have other people walking around. You don't have like regular furniture, and there's no texture. And so one of the things that we had to do was I ended up drawing a lot of inspiration from prairie style, which living in Chicago, there's an abundance of. But having that angular, it actually became the game became very ornamental. So it's the architectural ornaments. They're not purely decorative. What they do is they provide a sense of scale. They
Mm-hmm.
make the rest of the buildings feel big. And one of the things that you want to do, if you have a lot of traversal in a first person game, is you don't want to have a flat surface. You want to kind of vary that so it feels like um, they're making progress. And
Yeah.
one of the early things, one of the like in an early version of the game, you used to have just these long stretches of flat surface without any texture, and you'd be walking on that and just not feel like you're making any progress. But as soon as you start to get those details in, then players can feel the velocity.
Mm-hmm.
But that yeah, it was not. I would say the art style, and even though we kind of settled on the fundamentals of it in 2015, 2016, the floor is colored, the walls are white-ish. and we kind of got this beige tone and the edge detection, and they fade out in the distance to the background color. Really, it wasn't until Arthur joined that it became, when you have so few elements, every single one has to be good.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can have the lines, but we had a lot of artifacts. They weren't perfect, but Arthur really came in and took it to 11. And we have this video on my YouTube channel that's an edge detection comparison. It's basically, we reshot the trailer that I put out in 2015, where there was a lot of anti-aliasing, there was a lot of um, artifacts in the edges. We reshot every single scene and did it, posted side by side. So there's the version from 2015, then the version from 2019, and you can see it's a world of difference. And like, maybe just at a very quick glance, you might not be able to. You're like, well, they're the same art style, but it's the details are really what makes Manifold Garden look the way it does.
Yeah, and that's always one of the more challenging aspects, especially for a lot of indie devs out there, that you normally don't have a lot of stuff to work with. So you really do have to make every single scene stand out, or people are just going to kind of gloss over your game like that.
Yeah, it's not just scenes, but the details. I think, yeah, having a certain level of polish does make a huge difference to the player experience. I used to, when I was younger, I used to not care that much about detail. I remember I was talking to this guy who was an architect, and he's like, I'm all about big ideas. So, when I design a house, I just care about the structure and the layout. I could care less about the color of the wall. And I used to think like that too. I thought, yeah, I'm a big idea. But then you kind of realize, it's such a shame. Like, imagine if this whole beautiful house and it's this, I don't know, orange wall that just completely ruins it. So I think, like, actually the details, I've sort of done a 180 on that idea. It's certainly, the idea is important in the outline, but I think ultimately it's the execution of the details that really bring it all together.
Yeah. And going back to your point about kind of setting up the transversal to be like very different and unique, I think one of my favorite aha moments while playing the game was I was going up like a very long set of stairs outside to try to get somewhere. I'm like this is taking forever, and then all of a sudden it clicked on me. Wait a minute, this loops. Why don't I just like fall down and I'll fall to the top of the area? And then I just started doing that. Like every time I went outside, just at some point I have to fall, just watch, all the infinite structures around you just like whiz by your head.
Yeah, I think it's that's that really for us, those moments, and you're experiencing architecture in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
You're experiencing it in a way that would be impossible to do in real life, right? Obviously, if you want to get upstairs, you're going to have to take the stairs or the elevator. But I think this is just a really, to me, that's what's magical about games is now you're actually, it's almost hard to describe it with the words that we have, because our language isn't really built for this kind of stuff. But you've experienced it. Like you had that, your mind clicked.
Yeah.
And okay, this is how I would behave in this space given these rules.
Yeah. I've always used the term almost like realistic fiction when I talk about kind of like the rules in a game, that it's not real. Again, like you can't just fall through the floor and end up on your roof, but these are the rules of the game space, and then that is kind of like the Bible for this world. So how do I use those rules to kind of accomplish my task?
Right. Yeah. A word I got from a historian is counterfactual physics. I guess in history they do a lot of counterfactual physics. What if this had happened instead of, what if X had happened instead of Y? And I think in Manifold Garden, you say counterfactual physics because sort of like what you said with the realistic fiction. Okay, what if these were the set of physics rules and these were the axioms of the world? Let's explore the consequences. But within this world, those are truth.
Yeah, it's not like you just throw everything into the world and you can change it, whenever you want. It's a different world, but it has this set of rules as opposed to this set of rules.
Right. and within the world,
Hmm.
those are fundamental truth, and we learn to work with those.
Yeah. Um, Brian asked two questions. I think the first one about thoughts on minimalism and abstraction in design. That may be a little bit too big, I think, for right now, since we have about 20 minutes, give or take. But his second question: any interesting player feedback on the environments, like as the game developed?
Yeah, we did a lot of playtesting. I think we were making the last year of development. We pushed out almost daily builds, and we'd invite new players to play the game and record videos and send us the footage, and we watched them. Um, there was it's hard to give specifics because everything else depends on that particular level. Even yesterday, I was watching a streamer play the game, and I saw she was kind of getting stuck in certain places, and immediately I was thinking, "Oh man, I can add this there to fix that. Why did I do that?" So a lot of it is not like there are general principles that kind of guide us, but a lot of it is just seeing where players go, seeing what they look at, seeing you know where they're standing, and is that okay? If they're there, then it's blocking the view of this puzzle. What
Mm-hmm.
can we do to change that?
Yeah, I had a few of those myself. There were, I think, two puzzles in the game that I got completely stumped on, like two completely different points in the game, and one of them was because I just did not see that one piece, like just because how I was oriented or how I was falling, I just did not see it, and it caused, and I basically thought I had no idea what I was doing there, and then
Right, and okay, if it's a secret
yeah.
that would make sense. Like, yes, we did want to hide it, but sometimes it's like, okay, that's not the point that I was trying to.
Hmm.
I didn't want that. I didn't like the point of that puzzle is not for you to have to look for this thing. So those are, as you just said it, we weren't able to get everything. I think
Hmm.
just the world wrapping and the gravity changing. There's just too much to encompass. So ultimately, there are things that slip through us, but it is yeah we are planning on an update, and while I don't want to change things significantly, I think there are certain elements that can help that. It's like I'm seeing players get stuck because a set of stairs is sort of misaligned, so they can't
Oh
actually walk
yeah,
up it.
yeah,
And it's like, okay, there's no reason why they should be stuck there,
yeah.
when we can just sort of add a little bit of yeah, like for there, the geometry is just unnecessarily hostile to the player.
Yeah, I noticed that in a few spots myself, a few like how the stairs are set up. Um, Brian asked, I think, two really good questions, and this kind of solves like the end of the cast question as well. He asked, "Do you see your games as developmental stepping stones, building to something greater in the future?" And then he asked, "How do you conceptualize yourself moving forward as a growing developer?"
Well, I think I used to see it as part of a stepping stone, when my original intention was to make the cyberpunk time traveling MMO, and this was supposed to be a practice project. I don't think of that so much anymore. Um, Certainly, I don't think I could have stuck with the game for so long had I just seen it as a stepping stone, right? Like, ultimately, it became the game that I wanted to make, that I wanted to have ideas in, that if I could only make one game, this would be it. I don't know if that's necessarily a good attitude to have. The question of, hey, do you? I was actually having lunch with uh, with a younger developer today. He's been working on this game, I think, for about a year, and it's this like RPG, and he's never made a game before. And I kind of looked at it and I thought, well, I think you should make a smaller game. This is just these RPGs have a tendency to get pretty massive, but at the same time, there's the argument that you should only like maybe it just makes sense to work on a project that you're really passionate about, and if you're passionate about this massive
Hmm.
game, that might be it, because maybe Like, does it make sense to work on a smaller game that you don't really care about? So I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I think ultimately it depends on each person. But for me, Manifold Garden was not a stepping stone. I think maybe it was at the beginning, but then in the end, I basically just put what I wanted to see in a game in there.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
The I don't know whether the next game is going to be that way. I don't know. I've not thought about the next project yet. How do I conceptualize myself moving forward as a growing developer? I think it's still too early for me. We shipped like 2 weeks ago, and we're still learning to transition. We've been so focused on a single goal, ship the game, and now all of a sudden we're being pulled in different directions, and kind of what worked well for that doesn't work well now. Like we used to do daily pushes to our beta testers, and that was fine. If it was broken, wasn't a big deal. But now we can't do that, right? Mm-hmm. Like people have different saves. It's different versions. Like everything we do has to take into all that into account. So we're moving into a cycle with 2 weeks development, then 1 week of intense QA, and then we ship a patch. Mm-hmm. So we don't want to be introducing new bugs by fixing old bugs, and so that's a learning curve for us to move on to like a bigger. Yeah, it's a transition period for the team. So I'm still learning about the post-launch process.
Yeah. And that actually takes me to, I know, like we could sit here for a few more hours and talk to you about design, but there's a few set questions I definitely wanted to bring up for the cast. So I'm more about kind of how the game got into like the 7-year development cycle, because I think this is very important for any developers watching us right now. Because for my regulars, that major part of what we talk about here on Game Wisdom is kind of what goes on behind the scenes when it comes to these games. Because a lot of people don't understand that. All they see is the title on a store page, and that's it. And I know that if we get involved here, these questions could also be an hour or two. So I'm going to do my best to try and keep things brief for you. So the first thing I want to bring up again is the fact that Manifold Garden, as we said, it developed over a 7-year cycle. It was originally supposed to be like a 1 month, 2 month prototype. For yourself, I know this may be kind of rough to talk about, but like, when did the game start to like drag on? Like, when did it start to become hard to like work on?
Right. So that first version took 3 months, and then 3-4 months. I remember I'm in Chicago. Young Horses, who made Octodad, they're also here. And in 2013, I went to their office. I met them at like one of the game dev events, and I showed them the game, and it was immediately there were a lot of problems, and I was very disappointed because I thought I was going to show them the game, and they were going to be like, "This is the next Portal. You are a genius. We've been working on our game for 2 years. Mm-hmm. Like, where have you been?" And of course, that was not it. There were a ton of problems. But it taught me very early on the importance of playtesting. Like, how I can think one thing is super obvious and no one else will get it. So I scrapped that version. And the second version, I had gotten this artist residency in Shanghai starting in April of 2013. So I was about to go there. And that was more from my balloon work, but in the art work, they have a lot of these residencies where you go to an art center and you spend like 3-6 months there. The idea is you sort of don't worry about the things in your regular life, and you can just focus on your art for a bit. So I thought I gave myself that 6 months. Okay, let's see if we can rewrite the game from scratch. And if it is promising, when I come back to Chicago in October, then I will make a choice on whether I want to continue it or not. And I think at that point, after 6 months, I decided I wanted to continue, but I was thinking maybe a year. But of course, then I went in 2014 in March, I went to GDC for the first time, and that's where I started to talk to a lot of developers. And that's sort of the first wave of kind of realistic feedback. Like, hey, this is kind of interesting, but you got style. This was before I had any of the shaders. I remember meeting Justin Ma, who made FTL, or one of the developers of FTL, and he's like, "This is okay. The mechanics are kind of cool, but your game looks like a generic first-person puzzle game. You have to work on your art style." And that inspired me to work on shaders. Rami Ismail of Lambier, I remember he looked at the game and he said, "At least 2 years," which is very. I did not want to hear that. But he turned out to be very prophetic. But yeah, it was just kind of like continuing there. I think where it started to become a drag, and where it was, or I would say 2015, about the second, third year of development, because at that time I was still in denial. I still thought the game was just 2 months away from release, and I was treating it like a sprint. So during that period, I would constantly stay up all night. I'd work 14, 16 hours. I'd be up until 8 in the morning. And because I would think, okay, if I can just stay up all night tonight, I can get enough done that I can in 2 months. And I think it was around that point that I started to, kind of late 2015, I realized that that wasn't going to happen. If I kept doing this, I was going to burn out. A lot of it was the indie apocalypse talks. Those were starting to bubble up. People were saying there were these highly anticipated games doing really well in the festival circuits that were coming out and not doing anywhere near as well as the developer thought. And I thought, I had expected, and I thought to myself, hey, if Manifold Garden comes out and doesn't do well, is this the only thing I've got in my life? So that's when I kind of took a step back and started to examine my life more. And the other thing too was I kept putting off life things. So it was like, hey, I'll start going to the gym after I finish the game. I'll start learning French, which I've been always wanted to do after I finish the game. And so all of a sudden, the game is this barrier to me living my life. And I think late 2015, I kind of had that realization that I need to stop living like that. I got to just do things. And I need to have a good routine. So it's a marathon, not a sprint. And then it was, so I think maybe when I turned 30, I then turned 30 like a year or two later. I started the game when I was 25. And at some point I was like, I have to finish it before I'm 30. 30 just seemed like this deadline. Then I turned 30 and I hadn't finished the game, and I was okay, I'll finish the game while I'm 30. And then I turned 31 and it was okay. It's just, this is my life now. And I'm just, whatever, like however long it takes, I'm just going to finish it. Because I think when you're in your 20s, you think like you have to do all this stuff and then set yourself up so that by the time you're 30, you've got this cool job and a house and kids or whatever, right? Like that wasn't even the image, but it just felt like I had to have it all figured out. So yeah, I'm 32 now and I shipped it, but part of what helped was no longer treating it like a sprint. It was a marathon, and I just took it one day at a time. So I didn't think about when I was going to finish. I just thought about, is the game better than it was yesterday? And actually, towards the end, I did get a little bit, maybe I'm a little too comfortable in this routine, and maybe I don't want to release, like maybe I'm holding myself back, but yeah, I think changing, I would say halfway through development, changing from a sprint mentality to a marathon mentality is what really helped.
Yeah. And that work-life balance is one of the more, I think, very hard to understand aspects of game development. Again, it's something you don't really know until you try to do it yourself. I interviewed a John Schaefer who went on.
Yes, I was just thinking of him because I read his post. Again, 7 years solo dev, and it was. I think he had it much worse. He talks about his. I think at some point he had like a prescription drug addiction. I mean, his weight gain and weight loss was enormous. So it never, for me, fortunately, it never quite got to the depth that John experienced. But there were a lot of things about what he wrote that I could
Yeah.
relate to.
Yeah. And again, like we said, the consumer never sees or really comprehends that side of game development, unfortunately. A few quick questions, and again, I know you have to go in the next few minutes. Ryu asked, how many hours a day did you work on Manifold Garden?
So like I said, I think early on I would just do, 14, 16 hours of kind of working all the time. I think when I did settle into a routine, it was like probably like 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. But that seems like a lot, but it was really manageable for me. And
Mm-hmm.
I'd often kind of just break the day into like three chunks of 3 hours,
Yeah.
3 to 2 hours. Um, and the afternoon I'd be streaming, which was kind of like, okay, it's not as productive as being totally focused, but I'm also not tempted to just
Yeah.
watch Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that helped for me. I think like, yeah, 7 to 8 hours a day, 6 days a week.
Yeah, I've been doing a little bit of that myself, like kind of like compartmentalizing my tasks each day. I know that when I'm like from like 3 to 4, I'm doing this. I'm not thinking about this. When I go 5 to 6, I do this. I don't think about that, and it seems to help out a lot, at least in terms of just having some kind of organizational structure.
Yeah, just being more intentional. I think one thing for me that uh, was a problem was I'd wake up and immediately I check my email, and of course there'd be a bug, so we'd go into fixing it. And like before I know it, it's 3 in the
Yeah,
afternoon. I'm still in my pajamas. I haven't eaten. I haven't drunk. I haven't had any water. And
yeah.
it's like, wait a minute, this can't go on.
I know I've done that myself. We've got a few more questions coming in, but since it's almost 7 p.m. my time, this will be officially the cutoff point for questions then. Because, again, if not, we'll be here for another hour or two, and I don't want to keep you too much from your meeting. But here are the final questions from the chat. I have one final question for you, and then we'll wrap it up. But Brian asked, any psychological changes you noticed while working through such a large project, and were there any proactive mental techniques you developed to help overcome those challenges?
Yeah, I definitely. I feel like a different person. I mean, I'm a lot more patient. If you had told me by like when I was 25 that this project would take 7 years, I would have said hell no. I would not have done it. But part of it is like for me, what works well is having a routine, doing the same thing every day. And that might sound really boring. I know there are some developers who they kind of do the tech nomad lifestyle. They're in Canada one day, Mexico the next, and then Europe. I can't do that. Like I don't want to worry about where to buy groceries or where I'm going to sleep. Like for me, I just need to do the same thing every day, and that really helps me. But there's uh, I actually learned this from one of these the language learning videos, and I'd always wanted to. I grew up in Canada, studied French, and it was like I studied it until 16 in school and could never really speak it that well. And there's always been this like personal goal of mine to learn it well and to speak it well. And in college, I would always do this thing. Maybe some of you can relate. You get spring break and you think, okay, I'm gonna become fluent in French in this week, and you and I check out a book from the library, and maybe the first day I get in like, but then the next day it's 6, and then the day after it's like 2, and then life happens, and at the end of the week you haven't learned anything and you feel bad, but then the next time, okay, this time 1 week I'm going to learn French. And I saw this video, and he talks about this guy talked about this concept of kaizen, this Japanese philosophy, which I guess they used in like the Toyota factories, but it's not thinking about the end goal. All you do, it's sort of like what I said earlier, you just think about being better than the day before.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of having the mindset of like, hey, I'm going to become fluent in French in X amount of time, the mindset is, I just want to be a little bit better today at French than I was yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you only get 5 minutes in, maybe you only learn, but you are better than yesterday. And I think that I just applied that to the same thing with the game. Because if I worry about, if I think about when this game, I'm just, you have a 7-year dev cycle. only one day has that game launched. The rest of the time, the game has not launched. So if you're just focusing about that launch date, you're always setting yourself up for failure. Or like you're like not launch, not launch, not launch, not launch. So instead, it's can I get a bit of work done? Is the game better today than it was yesterday? And that's all I focused on. Um,
Yeah. I think that's a great way to live by too. Um, Here's the final question. Jim Clover asks, "How early on did Apple Arcade get involved with you with getting Manifold Garden on it, or can you talk?"
Apple did not get involved until I think like May, June this year. It was
Okay.
super late. I never considered doing mobile. I just did not think it was possible. And I think what happened was we got into we're in a conversation, and I think they were very interested. They like wanted to talk, and I was just like, "There's no way that's going to happen." But Manifold Garden was originally projected to ship in August of this year. Well, it was projected to ship in April, and then I missed that, and I just thought August. And Apple Arcade was scheduled for September. And I think a big reason why they were so interested was, the timing lined up, and we could be a launch title. But yeah, we had 3 months to bring the game to Apple Arcade. We ended up bringing on two studios, Acapara Games and GameCake, both out in LA. And Acapara did all the boilerplate, so Game Center integration, iCloud, and GameCake just did the touch controls, just the design of it, the feel of it.
Mm.
And I'm super happy with that. There are some problems we're gonna fix it in the second patch, specifically like what works for the iPhone doesn't work for iPad for the larger screens. You have to move your hand more.
Mm-hmm.
But it feels intuitive. It doesn't feel like we just kind of threw a virtual joystick
Mm.
on. But yeah,
Yeah, and that is a discussion I would love to have. Talking more about kind of porting the game to motion controls or touch base. But here's my final question, because again, I'm like holding back so many things to bring up here for you. But I know I think you talked a little bit about your decision to go exclusively onto the Epic Games Store. And I know
sure.
that was, of course, that's been a very polarizing topic for a lot of people these days. So I just wanted to kind of give you a chance to talk a little bit about that for any developers listening to us right now.
Yeah, our reception for the most was very positive. I think people were very understanding. Of course, there's certain communities on the internet that it doesn't matter what you do, they'll be against that, and a lot of times, um, it's it's so weird to me how people will construct these narratives about you to fit their agenda. Because people say we turn around, we spat in our fans' faces, and I've been streaming development almost every day for 4 years. If you want to come and talk to me, if you want to see how the game is done, I'm available. I'm on Twitter. I used to, when those threads come up, I would go in and I would answer every single person's questions. But I realized part of it towards the end was it was like futile. But for us, what it came down to is it gave us stability as a studio. Like, people don't realize how much these games cost. I worked on
Yeah.
the game for 7 years without income. It was like I lived off of, I think, 20,000 a year. Um, I had no retirement, no savings, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people like Steam right now is a very, very tough market. It's very volatile. I think Mike Rose I think he used to be Tiny Build, No More Robots now, but he does a lot of analysis on Steam. The average game on Steam makes $16,000 in the first year. $16,000.
Mm-hmm.
People say, well, how did indie survive in 20? What Steam was in 2012 is very different than Steam is now.
Yeah.
Back then, there was one game that came out a day, right? Like, you came out, you had that audience. Like, even if your game wasn't that great, there were enough people who'd see it
Yeah.
to buy it that you can survive. But now, like 16,000, we wouldn't even be enough. That's not even enough to pay back our investors. So, yeah, for us, Epic really helped us out. I mean, they gave us the funding that was needed to bring on additional resources to get QA. I was able to tell everyone on the team, like, hey, we can continue working on the game and supporting it, right? Because when a game comes out on a store, you don't get paid with the first purchase. Usually there's like a month or
Yep.
two. So you actually have to have enough money after you ship to survive that. And now on top of that, we have investors to repay. So like
Yep.
that could even be maybe 4 or 5 months. But with that funding, I was like, hey, you guys all have jobs. Like we can continue, we can bring it to other platforms, continue to work on the game.
Yep.
And like we're not super stressed. Apple, when we launched, I think we had 36 hours. That's not a lot of time. Like in, I think a more typical, a traditional launch that you would, that's a very challenging situation. But Epic kind of gave us the necessary buffer to kind of weather that.
Yep. And again, it's a very complicated process with when it comes to surviving as a developer. And again, I am resisting the urge to ask you more questions about this. But and if you're free in the future, well, it will be a pleasure to have you back on and talk more about the design and what you're working on.
Absolutely, yes, I'd be happy to.
Yeah. So to end the cast on, do you have anything you'd like to say to the fans, people watching, anything to kind of, I guess, tie a ribbon on our cast?
Just thank you to everyone for the support over the years. I think the community was there when I think they believed in the game more than me sometimes because I'd show up on stream and I'd be like, today sucks. This game's never gonna get done, and they were there to talk me out of it. So we're just super grateful for the community for the support. And check out the game. I hope you enjoy it.
Great. And like I said at the start, I think everyone in the chat can agree with me. Definitely, congratulations on getting the game released. I think that needs to be said to more developers out there because it is a process, no matter how you go into it in terms of what can make these games work. And for so many developers who try to make their first game, a lot of them sometimes end up, crashing and burning. And I think more people need to understand that. But again, thank you so much for coming on. Best of luck with whatever you have planned next.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. So, for everybody watching this live recorded, thank you for tuning in. Again, if you'd like to hang out with me on Discord, we have an invitation link down below. Be sure to check out our Patreon as well as my 2 books on game design, 20 Essential Games to Study and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers. And for you, Will, for people watching us who want to follow you or check things out, do you have any social media you would like to plug right now?
Probably my Twitch channel. It would just be twitch.tv/William Chyr. That's sort of my main platform and where I'm at.
All right. And for you watching, be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where is in the art and science of games. And if you are a developer working on a game and like to come on for a cast, we are always looking for new guests, so please don't hesitate to get in touch. But that's going to do it for our stream. So once again, be sure to check out Manifold Garden out now. And when will it be on Steam for the people watching?
It will be on Steam October 2020.
Okay. And I'll have my video and written reviews up. For those of you watching this recorded, they'll be in the description down below. But have a great night, everybody. And, thank you, Wintrick, for the very, very last-minute super chat donation. I really do appreciate that. But thank you again for coming out, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where is in the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.